She could not manage a kitchen, Lady Maud Rothwell announced, her voice carrying across the small drawing room with the clarity of a struck bell. She has no sense of household economy. None at all. Honora, the subject of this pronouncement, did not look up from her mending. She sat by the window, the weak afternoon light falling across her plain gray dress, her needle moving with a swift, even rhythm through the worn linen of a tablecloth. She had been Gideon Rothwell's wife for 3 months and mistress of Kestrel Chase for 3 hours. The latter was a title only, a courtesy. The true mistress was the woman enthroned in the wing-back chair by the fire, her fingers heavy with rings, the heavy silver keys to the estate's larders and storerooms glinting at her waist. The marriage had been a transaction, plain and simple. Honora's guardian and uncle, Mr. Percival Trent, had gambled away the last of her modest inheritance. Gideon Rothwell, the master of Kestrel Chase, a man made of silence and shadow since his return from the wars and the death of his first wife, needed a wife to secure the estate's lineage and a sum of money to invest in new agricultural machinery. Mr. Trent had debts. Mr. Rothwell had needs. Honora was the currency they exchanged. She had met her husband twice before the wedding, once in a solicitor's office, where he had looked not at her face, but at the contract, his questions clipped and impersonal. The second time was at the altar, where he had spoken his vows in a low, dispassionate monotone. He had departed for London on business the following day, leaving her in the cold, cavernous expanse of Kestrel Chase with his mother for company. Lady Maud saw Honora not as a daughter, but as an indictment of her son's poor judgment. A bride with no fortune and no connections, a plain, quiet girl who did not flatter or fawn. And so, Lady Maud wielded her power in the only way she knew how, through the daily, grinding humiliation of domestic authority. Honora was forbidden from the kitchens, excluded from discussions of menus, and ignored in conversations about the running of the house she was supposed to command. Her role was to be decorative, and as she was not, in Lady Maud's opinion, particularly decorative, she was simply to be invisible. So Honora sat and sewed and listened. She listened to the complaints of the staff, whispered in corridors when they thought she was out of earshot. The cook, Mrs. Hobbs, grumbling about the poor quality of flour Lady Maud insisted on buying from a cousin's mill. The maids speaking of watered-down milk and the best cuts of meat being sold off to a butcher in Marley for Lady Maud's private purse. Kestrel Chase was a great house, bleeding from 1,000 tiny cuts of mismanagement and greed. The ledgers, which Honora had glimpsed once on the housekeeper's desk, were a chaotic mess of blotched ink and questionable figures. She did not cry. She had learned long ago, in the drafty house of her feckless uncle, that tears changed nothing. They were a currency with no value. Instead, she watched. She learned the geography of the house, the rhythm of its groans and sighs. She learned which floorboards creaked, which windows rattled in the wind, and which of the servants had honest eyes. She walked the grounds, noting the state of the tenant farms, the neglected kitchen garden choked with weeds, the apple trees whose fruit was left to rot on the ground. She saw a great estate, rich in land and potential, slowly starving itself from the inside out. And she did nothing, because she had no power. The keys, the heavy silver keys, hung from another woman's belt. Her life was a state of endurance, a long, quiet waiting for a change that might never come. One evening, a chill wind whistling through the ill-fitting window frames, word came from the village of Netherfold. A tenant farmer's youngest child, a boy named Tam, was sick with a fever that would not break. The doctor had been, and had shaken his head, prescribing only warmth and nourishing broth. The boy's mother had sent his older sister to the great house to beg for a little soup, a crust of good bread. Lady Maud had received the girl in the hall. "The kitchens are closed for the night," she had declared, her voice echoing in the cold space. "And we are not an almshouse. Tell your mother to be more prudent with her stores next time." The girl had departed in tears, clutching a single, stale roll the footman had slipped into her hand out of pity. Honora heard it all from the top of the stairs. She felt a familiar, cold anger settle in her stomach. It was not just cruel. It was foolish. A landlord's greatest asset was his tenants. To let them weaken and fall ill was to mortgage the estate's future for a bowl of soup. Later, when the house was draped in silence and the clocks were ticking their way toward midnight, Honora slipped from her cold bedroom. She made her way down the back stairs, her bare feet silent on the worn stone. The kitchens were dark and frigid. Mrs. Hobbs, the cook, had locked away the best ingredients as per Lady Maud's orders, but she was a creature of habit. A small bin of vegetable peelings and chicken bones for the stock pot remained on the counter. A half-empty sack of oats was tucked behind a barrel. A few hardy herbs still grew in a pot by the scullery window. Honora set to work. She built up the embers in the great hearth, her movements economical and sure. She found a small pot and set water to boil with the bones and vegetable scraps. She added the oats, a pinch of salt she found in a cracked bowl, and the thyme and rosemary from the window pot. It was not a rich broth, but it would be hot, savory, and nourishing. While it simmered, she found a bit of leftover dough, kneading it with a little hoarded flour from a dusty canister. She shaped it into a small, flat loaf and set it to bake on the hearthstone. The air in the vast, cold kitchen began to fill with the scent of thyme and baking bread. It was the first honest, welcoming smell the room had known in months. She was wrapping the finished loaf in a clean cloth when a shadow fell across the doorway. She did not startle. She simply finished her knot and looked up. It was Gideon, her husband. He had not been expected back from London for another week. He stood there, a tall, severe figure cloaked in darkness, his face unreadable. He had clearly just arrived. The dust of the road was still on his greatcoat. He watched her for a long, silent moment, his gaze taking in the pot, the bread, her flour-dusted hands. The air crackled with a tension that was neither hostile nor welcoming. It was simply observant. His voice, when it came, was low and rough from travel. "For whom?" It was the first direct question he had ever asked her. Honora did not fluster or offer a long explanation. She met his gaze directly. "For the tenant's child at Netherfold," she said, her own voice quiet but clear. "The boy, Tam, he has a fever." Gideon Rothwell's expression did not change. He did not praise her, nor did he rebuke her. He simply gave a single, sharp nod, turned on his heel, and was gone, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor until they were swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. Honora stood alone in the warmth of the hearth, the small loaf clutched in her hands, a strange and unfamiliar feeling fluttering in her chest. It was not hope. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was possibility. The next morning, the confrontation was not the storm Honora had anticipated. It was a quiet squall, far more devastating. Gideon summoned his mother to his study before breakfast. Honora was not invited, but the study doors were thick oak, not stone, and she was arranging late-blooming roses in a vase in the hall. She could not help but overhear. His voice was a low murmur, hers a sharp, indignant reply. "The height of insolence going behind my back. She went behind your back to feed a sick child." Gideon's voice cut through his mother's. devoid of emotion, but sharp as glass. A child living on my land. A family who pays their rent to me. You refused them aid. We are not a charity. If you give handouts, they will never learn to be self-sufficient. It is a matter of principle." There was a short, sharp silence. Then Gideon spoke again, and his voice was colder than the autumn wind. "The principle is this. Kestrel Chase cares for its own. That is my only principle in this matter. Give me the keys, Mother." "I will not. I have managed this house for 30 years. And I have owned it for 10. The keys." Honora heard the rustle of silk, the furious clatter of metal on wood. A moment later, the study door opened. Lady Maud swept past, her face a mask of thunderous rage, her eyes fixing on Honora for a second with pure venom before she ascended the grand staircase. Gideon stood in the doorway of his study. He looked at Honora, who stood frozen, a white rose in her hand. He held the great, heavy ring of tarnished silver keys. They were not offered with a smile or a kind word. His face was as grim and remote as ever. He simply held them out to her. "The household is now yours to manage," he said. It was not a request. It was a command, a transfer of power. "The ledgers are to be balanced weekly. The staff are your responsibility. Report only to me." Honora stepped forward and took the keys. Their weight was surprising, solid and real in her palm. Each one represented a door, a room, a responsibility. The key to the wine cellar, the pantry, the linen press, the smokehouse. They were the tangible form of authority in this world. She curled her fingers around them, the cold metal biting into her skin. "I understand," she said. He gave another of his curt nods and retreated back into the shadows of his study, closing the door behind him. The alliance, if it could be called that, was forged. It was not a partnership of affection, but a contract of competence. He had seen in her not a wife, but a potentially efficient steward for his neglected property. For Honora, it was enough. It was more than she had had yesterday. She looked down at the keys in her hand. They were not a gift of love, but they were a tool, and Honora knew how to use tools. Her first act was to walk into the kitchens. Mrs. Hobbs, the cook, a woman with arms as thick as hams and a perpetually sour expression, watched her approach, hands on her hips. The other kitchen staff fell silent, expecting a confrontation. Honora did not give orders. She did not sweep in with pronouncements of change. She walked to the great wooden work table in the center of the room and placed the ring of keys upon it. The sound they made was a solid, definitive thud. "Mrs. Hobbs," she said, her voice calm and even, "I am told you are the best cook in this part of the county, but that you have been working with inferior ingredients. I would like you to make me a list of everything you need to make this kitchen worthy of Kestrel Chase again." The cook's jaw dropped slightly. She stared at Honora, then at the keys, then back at Honora. For a moment, she seemed to be searching for a trick, a trap. Finding none in Honora's plain, earnest face, a slow, grudging respect began to dawn in her eyes. "A list, madam?" she asked, her voice gruff. "Yes," Honora replied. "And then I would like you to show me the storerooms. We must take a full inventory before we can begin." That was the start. Honora did not command. She consulted. She did not criticize. She asked questions. She spent the first week not changing a thing, but learning everything. With Mrs. Hobbs at her side, she unlocked doors that had been sealed for years. They found storerooms where sacks of grain had gone to weevils, shelves of preserves that had spoiled from improper sealing, and wine cellars where dust lay so thick it seemed to drink the light. It was a catalogue of waste and neglect, a physical manifestation of Lady Maud's selfish, short-sighted rule. Honora did not sigh or complain. She took out a fresh ledger, one of several she had purchased with her own small pin money in Marley, and began to make lists. Her handwriting was small, neat, and precise. Every sack of spoiled flour, every broken cask, every yard of moth-eaten linen was recorded. It was a grim accounting, but it was an honest one. She worked from dawn until long after the house had fallen silent. Gideon remained at the estate, a silent, watchful presence. He did not interfere, but Honora was always aware of him. Sometimes she would look up from her ledgers in the small parlor late at night to find him standing in the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. He never offered praise, but he did something more significant. He stopped taking his meals alone in his study. First, it was just supper. He would sit opposite her at the small dining table, the great, echoing, formal dining room left to dust and darkness. Their meals were quiet affairs. The food, now made with good flour and fresh butter, was simple but delicious. Mrs. Hobbs was cooking with a renewed vigor. The silence between them was no longer the awkward, empty silence of strangers. It was becoming a shared, companionable quiet, punctuated by the clink of silverware and the crackle of the fire. Then he began to join her for breakfast. He would find her in the garden, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill, inspecting the progress of the 2 gardeners she had hired to reclaim the overgrown vegetable patches. He would stand beside her, sipping his tea, and listen as she explained her plans for a winter crop of kale and leeks. He rarely commented, but he listened. And in a man who spoke so little, his attention was a profound gesture. The house itself began to change. It was not a sudden transformation, but a slow, quiet awakening. The scent of beeswax and lemon replaced the musty smell of neglect. Fires were lit in the hearths, their warmth pushing back the perpetual chill. The staff, now paid their wages in full and on time, worked with a lighter step. Mrs. Hobbs's gruffness softened, her approval signaled by an extra spoonful of cream in Honora's soup or a particularly fine pastry left on her desk. Kestrel Chase was breathing again. One afternoon, Gideon found Honora in the library, a room he had always considered his private sanctuary. She was not reading, but standing on a ladder, carefully dusting the spines of the books on the highest shelf. Her face was smudged with dirt, a stray strand of brown hair had escaped its pin, and she was humming softly to herself. She looked, for the first time since he had met her, not like a woman enduring her fate, but like a woman at peace in her own home. He watched her for a full minute before he spoke. "The ledgers are balanced." It was a statement, not a question. She looked down, a small smile touching her lips. "To the half-penny," she confirmed. "We have reduced household waste by nearly 60%. Once the winter garden begins to produce, that will improve further." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face. "My mother said you had no sense of household economy." "Your mother," Honora said, carefully wiping a leather-bound volume of Virgil, "was mistaken." There was no malice in her tone, only a simple statement of fact. And in that moment, Gideon Rothwell felt the first true crack in the ice that had encased his heart for years. It was not pity he felt for this quiet, competent woman. It was not even gratitude. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, For the first time, the quiet transformation of his house was beginning to work its magic on its master. The news of the changes at Kestrel Chase traveled, as all news did, to the nearby town of Marley, and it reached the ears of Lady Maud Rothwell, now installed in the dower house at the edge of the estate. Her removal from power had been a bitter pill, and she had no intention of swallowing it gracefully. She found a willing and eager ally in her campaign against Honora, Miss Arabella Vaughan. Arabella was everything Honora was not. She was beautiful, wealthy, and polished to a high shine. Her family owned the neighboring estate, and before Honora's arrival, it had been widely assumed that Arabella would be the second Mrs. Gideon Rothwell. She viewed Honora not just as a rival, but as an insult, an upstart who had stolen her rightful place. Together, they began their quiet war. It was a war fought not with swords, but with whispers. At tea parties and market days, Lady Maud would sigh theatrically and speak of her concern for her son. "The new mistress is, well, she tries her best, of course, but she has no breeding. She is turning Kestrel Chase into a mere farmhouse, pinching every penny until it squeaks. The staff are practically starved, I hear." Arabella would then add her own poison, delivered with a sympathetic smile. "One can hardly blame her. Without a dowry, she is likely trying to build her own little nest egg from the household accounts. It is what her sort does, after all." The rumors were insidious, spreading through the county like a blight. Honora, who rarely went into town, was largely unaware of the campaign being waged against her. She was focused on her work. An unusually cold autumn was turning toward a bitter winter, and the harvest had been poor across the region. She knew the estate's tenants and the villagers in Marley, Netherfold, and Coombe Norton would suffer. With Gideon's quiet approval, she had used the money saved from her efficiencies to purchase a large store of grain and salted meat at a fair price, filling the Kestrel Chase storerooms to capacity. Her plan was not to hoard it, but to ensure no family on their lands went hungry through the cold months. The opposition escalated from slander to a direct attack. A grain merchant in Marley, a man named Fletcher, whose business was heavily indebted to Arabella Vaughan's father, was enlisted in their scheme. He appeared at Kestrel Chase one afternoon, loudly demanding payment for a massive delivery of seed grain he claimed Honora had ordered and refused to pay for. Honora met him calmly in the estate office. "There must be some mistake," she said. "We purchased all our seed grain for the winter planting from the mill at Kingsbrook. I have the receipt here." "No mistake, madam," Fletcher blustered, his face red. "Here is the order, in your own ledger." He slapped the estate's acquisitions book down on the desk. It was open to a fresh page, and on it, in a passable imitation of Honora's neat hand, was an entry for 50 sacks of premium seed grain from Fletcher's Mercantile, with a staggering price beside it. Below it, a note. "Paid from household cash box, G.R." The implication was clear. She had taken Gideon's money and kept it for herself, while refusing to pay the merchant. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Mrs. Hobbs, who had followed Honora into the office, gasped. This was not just a matter of a disputed bill. It was an accusation of theft and forgery, an attack on Honora's very character. That evening, Gideon was presented with the evidence. It was not Fletcher who brought it, but a delegation of 2 local landowners, friends of the Vaughans, who presented it as a matter of neighborly concern. They laid the merchant's complaint and the falsified ledger before him in his study. Gideon, a man who prized evidence and facts above all else, listened to them without expression, his face carved from stone. When they had gone, he sent for Honora. She entered the study to find him standing by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. The ledger lay open on his desk, the damning entry exposed under the lamplight. The room was cold, the silence heavy with unspoken questions. For the first time, the companionable quiet between them was gone, replaced by a tense, painful gulf. He turned from the window, his eyes dark and searching. He did not accuse her. He did not yell. He simply gestured to the open book on his desk. "Explain this," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. It was the ultimate test. All her hard work, all the fragile trust she had painstakingly built, rested on this single moment. A different woman might have wept, or panicked, or launched into a frantic, defensive denial. Honora did none of these things. She walked calmly to the desk and looked down at the forged entry. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but her hands were steady. She had learned self-control in the hardest of schools. She studied the handwriting, the placement of the entry, the unnatural freshness of the ink. Her memory, always precise and orderly, replayed the transactions of the past month. She breathed in once, slowly, and then looked directly at her husband. "That is not my handwriting," she said, her voice perfectly level. "The slant is wrong, and the loop on the G is too wide. I have never purchased anything from Mr. Fletcher. As I told him this afternoon, our winter seed was bought from the Kingsbrook mill. I paid the bill myself, in person, to the miller's son on the 5th of October. The payment was 3 gold sovereigns." She paused, holding Gideon's gaze. "The receipt is in the top left drawer of this desk, filed under G for grain." The silence in the room stretched, taut and thin. Gideon's eyes did not leave her face. He was weighing her words, her composure, against the physical evidence in the book. He was a man of ledgers and laws, of things that could be proven, and she had just given him a path to proof. He moved to the desk, his movements deliberate. He pulled open the top left drawer. It was filled with neatly bundled papers, organized alphabetically by Honora's own hand. He found the section marked G. He pulled out a small stack of receipts, and on the top was a slip of paper from the Kingsbrook mill, detailing a purchase of winter seed. It was dated the 5th of October, and at the bottom, in a flourish of dark ink, was the signature of the miller's son, acknowledging receipt of 3 gold sovereigns. He stood there for a long time, holding the small piece of paper that was the proof of her honesty. He looked from the receipt to the forged ledger, and then, finally, back to her. The coldness in his expression did not vanish, but it was transformed. The doubt was replaced by a slow-burning fury, a chilling anger directed not at her, but at those who had sought to destroy her. The trust between them, so new and untested, had been put to the fire. It had not broken. It had hardened into something strong and resilient. Gideon's perspective. He felt the rage as a physical thing, a pressure building behind his ribs. It was an old, familiar feeling, one he had not truly experienced since the war. The cold, precise anger that came before a battle. He looked at Honora, standing so still and quiet in the lamplight, and he understood the true nature of the attack. They had not merely accused her of mismanagement. They had not just questioned her bookkeeping, they had attacked her integrity. They had tried to poison the one quality in her he had come to value above all others, her unshakable, unadorned honesty. In the month she had been at Kestrel Chase, he had watched her. He had seen her quiet competence, her refusal to complain, her methodical restoration of his decaying home. He had felt the house itself begin to thaw around him, and he had dimly understood that he was thawing with it. But he had held himself apart, observing her as he would a capable steward, an efficient machine for putting his world back in order. Now, seeing the crude forgery, the carefully constructed lie designed to ruin her, he realized his feelings were no longer so simple. It was not his steward they had attacked. It was his wife. The thought was a shock, sharp and clear. Somewhere along the way, in the quiet evenings and shared meals, in the sight of her dirt-smudged face in his library, the contract had become a marriage. His duty to the estate had become a duty to her, and the quiet respect he felt had deepened into something fiercely protective. He had been numb for so long, encased in the grief for his first wife and the horrors of the battlefield. He had sought a wife who would demand nothing of him emotionally, who would simply manage his home while he remained in his fortress of solitude. Honora had done that. She had asked for nothing. But in asking for nothing, she had offered everything: loyalty, competence, and a quiet dignity that was more beautiful than any polished charm. They had tried to break that dignity. They had tried to use his own reliance on evidence against him, to make him the instrument of her destruction. He would not allow it. He would turn their own weapons back upon them, and he would do it not in the shadows, but in the full light of day. The first snows of winter arrived early that year, a thick white blanket that covered the bleak, harvested fields and silenced the world. For many in the 3 villages that bordered the Kestrel Chase estate, the beauty of the snow was a mask for the terror of a long, hungry winter. The harvest had failed them, but Honora had not. Her careful planning and Gideon's investment were about to bear fruit. She organized a system, as methodical and precise as her ledgers. Each tenant family on the estate, and any family from Marley, Netherfold, or Coombe Norton who presented themselves at the gates, would receive a weekly ration. It was not charity, she explained to Gideon. It was a loan of sustenance, to be worked off in the spring with repairs to fences and the clearing of ditches. It was an investment in the community that kept the estate alive. Lady Maud and Arabella Vaughan saw this as their final, perfect opportunity. They would stage a public unmasking. They began to spread the word that the mad mistress of Kestrel Chase was squandering the estate's winter stores, throwing food away on vagrants to make herself popular. They whispered that soon the house itself would be starving, all because of the foolishness of a low-born woman playing at being a lady. They arranged for the local magistrate, Sir John Irving, to pay a surprise visit to Kestrel Chase, accompanied by a half-dozen of the county's most influential gentry. Among them, by Arabella's specific invitation, was Lady Cassandra Fenwick, a formidable old dowager whose sharp tongue and even sharper mind could make or break a reputation with a single pronouncement. The plan was to arrive on a distribution day and discover the chaos, the waste, the ruinous mismanagement, and to have Honora publicly shamed and censured. They arrived in a procession of fine carriages on a bitterly cold Tuesday morning. They swept into the great hall of Kestrel Chase, expecting to find a scene of noisy, desperate chaos. Instead, they found quiet, dignified order. A long line of villagers snaked from the courtyard into the hall, which was warm and bright with firelight. They were not a mob, but an orderly queue. At a series of trestle tables, Honora stood with Mrs. Hobbs and two of the sturdiest footmen. She was not ladling out slop from a great cauldron. She was presiding over a system of meticulous distribution. Each family received a carefully weighed parcel: a sack of flour, a portion of salted beef, a net of potatoes and onions from the newly productive kitchen garden. Honora consulted a large ledger, making a neat tick beside each family's name, speaking quietly to each person, asking after their children, offering a word of encouragement. It was a picture not of chaotic charity, but of a community being carefully and respectfully sustained. By winter, the kitchen Lady Maud had claimed Honora could not manage was feeding 3 villages. Arabella Vaughan, her face tight with fury at the scene, refused to be thwarted. She strode forward, her voice ringing with false concern. "Mrs. Rothwell, what is the meaning of this? You are giving away the entire estate." "Sir John, you must see, this is madness. She is buying favor with thieves and beggars, while the house itself will surely starve by spring." The merchant, Fletcher, was pushed forward from the back of the crowd of gentry. "It's true," he cried, playing his part. "She doesn't pay her bills. She orders goods and then claims they were never delivered. She cannot be trusted with money." Lady Cassandra Fenwick raised a quizzical eyebrow, her sharp eyes moving from Arabella's theatrical display to Honora's calm, composed face. Honora did not speak. She did not need to. From the shadows near the grand staircase, Gideon Rothwell stepped into the light. He was not dressed for a social call, but in the plain, severe coat of a landowner. He moved without haste, an aura of cold authority radiating from him. He held a small sheaf of papers in his hand. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. "You claim my wife refused to pay you for a delivery of grain." "I do, my lord. It is in your own ledger book." "Indeed," Gideon said. He held up one of the papers. "Then perhaps you can explain your own signature on this receipt from the Kingsbrook Mill, acknowledging full payment for my wife's purchase of grain on the 5th of October. He then held up a second paper. "And this letter, from a handwriting expert in London, which attests that the entry in my ledger is a forgery, and a clumsy one at that." A collective gasp went through the assembled gentry. Fletcher, the merchant, turned a ghastly shade of white. Gideon's cold gaze shifted to Arabella. "This entire performance was orchestrated to humiliate my wife. You preyed upon a merchant's debts to force him into slander. You spread malicious lies throughout the county. You have brought this body of respected persons here under false pretenses to witness a cruelty of your own design." He took a step closer, and his voice dropped even lower, a blade of ice. "You have misjudged my wife. And you have misjudged me. Kestrel Chase is not in danger of starving. It is stronger than it has been in a generation. It is strong because its mistress is wise and capable and honest." He turned his eyes to the assembled crowd. Qualities that seemed to be in short supply this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Fletcher began to stammer an apology, but fell silent under Gideon's gaze. Arabella Vaughan stood frozen, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Her plot had not just failed, it had been turned back on her, exposing her own malice and dishonesty in front of the very people she sought to impress. It was Lady Cassandra Fenwick who broke the spell. She looked at the receipt in Gideon's hand, at the white-faced merchant, at the humiliated Arabella, and then at Honora, who had watched the entire scene unfold with a quiet, unshakable dignity. "Well," the old dowager declared, her voice dry as dust, "it seems the only thing being mismanaged here, Miss Vaughan, is your own ambition." The pronouncement was a death sentence to Arabella's social standing. The public reckoning was complete. The vindication was total. That evening, the house was profoundly quiet. The last of the villagers had departed, their footsteps muffled by the freshly fallen snow. The disgraced gentry had made their hasty, awkward retreats. A deep peace settled over Kestrel Chase, the peace that comes after a storm has passed. Honora stood before the great fireplace in the hall, the flames casting dancing shadows on the ancient stone. She was exhausted, the tension of the day finally seeping out of her, leaving a hollow ache in its place. In her hand she held the ring of silver keys. She had been turning them over and over, the metal cool against her skin. She heard his footsteps behind her and turned. Gideon stopped a few feet away from her. The firelight softened the harsh lines of his face, warming the gray of his eyes. For a long time he simply looked at her, his expression one she had never seen before. It was open, vulnerable, and filled with a depth of feeling that stole her breath. "My mother said you could not manage a kitchen," he said, his voice low and raw. "She was wrong. You have not managed a kitchen. You have managed a county." He closed the distance between them and gently took her free hand. It was cold, and he chafed it between his own warm palms. Then, to her utter astonishment, he went down on one knee before her on the cold flagstones of the hall. It was not a grand, theatrical gesture. It was simple, solid, and deeply sincere. He looked up at her, his gaze unwavering. "I entered into this marriage as a contract," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him. "I was wrong. I was a fool. I am asking you now to enter into it again, but as my wife, in truth, as my partner, as the heart of this house, which you have already brought back to life." He paused, and his grip on her hand tightened. "Will you choose to stay, Honora? Will you choose me?" He had called her by her name. He had asked her to choose. After a lifetime of being a pawn, a currency, a ward, a duty, she was being given a choice. She looked down at this quiet, guarded man, now kneeling before her, offering her not just his name and his home, but his heart. The answer was not a calculation or a decision. It was a simple, overwhelming truth. Tears she had refused to shed in humiliation or anger now welled in her eyes, tears of a profound and startling joy. "Yes," she whispered. It was the only word she could manage. He rose to his feet. He took the hand that held the keys and gently uncurled her fingers. He did not take the keys from her. Instead, he simply closed his own hand over hers, enveloping them both in his warmth. "Together," he said. And it was a vow. 1 year later, winter came again to Kestrel Chase. But it was a different winter. The house was no longer a place of cold shadows and echoing silence. It was filled with light and warmth and the murmur of life. The fires in the hearths burned brightly, warding off the chill, and the scent of pine and baking gingerbread hung in the air. From the kitchens, which were now the vibrant heart of the estate, came the sound of Mrs. Hobbs humming a cheerful, off-key carol. Honora and Gideon stood at the tall window in the library, looking out at the grounds, serene and white under a thick blanket of snow. In the distance, the lights of Marley and Netherfold twinkled in the dusk, small points of warmth in the vast landscape. The harvest had been good this year, the tenants were prosperous, and the storerooms of Kestrel Chase were full once more. But this year, their bounty was not a defense against starvation, but a source for celebration. Gideon came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a familiar, comforting weight. The past year had transformed him. The harsh lines of his face had softened, the guarded silence replaced by a quiet contentment. He smiled now, a slow, rare smile that was reserved only for her. "Lady Cassandra Fenwick has sent a note," he murmured into her hair. "She wishes to know if your farmhouse will be serving her favorite plum pudding at the Christmas feast." Honora leaned back into his embrace, a soft laugh escaping her. "I believe Mrs. Hobbs can be persuaded." Their life was one of quiet joys. The sharp-tongued Lady Cassandra had become a frequent visitor and Honora's staunchest ally in the county. Arabella Vaughan had married a minor baronet with debts and moved to the north, never to be heard from again. Lady Maud remained in the dower house, a distant, bitter figure they rarely saw. Kestrel Chase, and its master, had chosen a new future. Honora's gaze fell upon the mantelpiece. There, hanging from a polished brass hook, was the heavy ring of old silver keys. She had insisted they be kept there, in the heart of the home. They were no longer a symbol of her burden or her authority. They had been polished until they shone, reflecting the firelight like captured stars. They were a reminder of how it had all begun, a reminder of a cold kitchen, a desperate act of kindness, and the man who had seen her competence when no one else had. They were a symbol of a home and a heart that had been unlocked. Gideon followed her gaze. He tightened his arms around her. "You brought the light back, Honora," he said softly. She turned in his arms and rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "No," she whispered, looking out at the peaceful, snow-covered land, safe and fed for the winter. "We did. Together." Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.